A legendary warlord known globally for his genius battle tactics, being the king of one of the most expansive empires in history, and also his extremely short stature. This man is known as Alexander the Great. But how did he earn the name Alexander the Great? Well, it all started at the start. Alexander's dad, Philip II, had conquered and united almost all of Greece, then got assassinated at a wedding by his own bodyguard. Alexander was the heir to the throne, and so he became king. Alexander became the king at a time of turmoil for the nation, though. There were rebellions all over Greece, and the extremely wealthy city-state of Thebes decided to secede from Alexander's rule as well. The newly appointed king was not going to go easy on these betrayals, though.
Now, I'm really mad!
He marched his soldiers throughout the nation, putting down all the rebellions. Man, we really clapped up that Philip guy, huh?
Yep, he had no idea it was coming.
Anyways, what should we do about that Alexander guy?
Let's just do the same thing we did to his dad.
Good idea.
Get on the ground, traitors!
Hey, we didn't do anything, quit it, man.
We know what you did to the king, and we'll show you what we do to traitors. After he dealt with these rebellions, he went down and dealt with the city-state of Thebes.
You up there, surrender the city immediately. You and everyone in the city are guilty of treason. We absolutely will not surrender the city, under any conditions. Come on, man, there is no way you win this fight. You are severely outnumbered and outmatched. Wrong? What do you mean I'm wrong? Well, you do know we have an elite army of exclusively gay people, right? Huh? Yeah, look it up, it's the Sacred Band of Thebes. Well, that is no matter, we shall invade anyway. Wait! What now? Well, you wouldn't want to be homophobic now, would you? Well, no, but we're invading the city, and enslaving all your people, and burning everything down. Well, then I guess there is no other way to convince you. Go ahead, try and bust down our mighty walls. But I'll let you know, these walls have stood for hundreds of years. And there will be no burning of Thebes tonight.
Alexander had shown he was not scared of battle, and the people of Greece gave a lot of respect to the new king.
我必须说，现在，在速度与激情中，我做很多采访，很多，所以在一个采访。
And with his newfound respect, Alexander rallied the people of Greece and into an invasion of Persia. Getting the people of Greece to attack Persia was not a difficult task. Persian people had been bullying Greece for a while.
You suck! You disgrace!
And the people of Greece were fed up with Persia. So Alexander took his men and started his conquest. The first battle Alexander would face was at the Battle of Granicus. The Battle of Granicus was fought at a river, with a Persian force of mostly cavalry defending the far coast, along with a force of great mercenaries hired by the Persians. Alexander needed to get his troops across the river without getting attacked. Alexander decided to lead his cavalry in a charge across the river that would serve as a distraction for his infantry to cross. He led a force of equal size, consisting of mostly phalangites, men with big pointy spears, and hoplites, men with normal spears and shields. This unit composition, along with superior battle tactics, led to an absolute slaughter for the Persian army. The Persians ended up retreating after losing thousands of troops. After the Persians retreated, the Greek mercenaries asked for mercy. Hoping that Alexander would spare Greek-born men, Alexander saw them as traitors though, and had them all either killed or enslaved. In the end, Alexander had won a decisive battle, losing only around 100 men, while Persians had lost more than 4,000. This stunning victory made the Persian satraps, who were basically governors, near the battle worried. If Alexander were to invade their land, they would be forced with a difficult choice. surrender to the Greeks, or fight an extremely strong force of well-trained soldiers. After the Battle of Granicus, Alexander would decide to continue his conquest into Persia. But this time his eyes were set on a large Persian city named Sardis.
Surrender now, Persians.
Okay, we surrender.
I said surrender. What? Wait, what?
Yeah, we surrender, man.
Really? I mean, yeah, that's right. Open up those gates.
You got it.
After Alexander captured Sardis, he turned his attention back to the rest of Persia. He noticed that the Persian navy might be a serious problem in the future, as it was much stronger than the Greek navy, and Alexander relied on Greek ships to resupply and sustain his army while he was in Persia. Alexander decided that there was no better way to cripple the navy than to just attack the port cities that the Persian ships relied on. So Alexander marched his soldiers from Sardis down to the coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both of these cities would not be pushed over as Sardis was though. They were ready for a fight. Miletus was captured without too much difficulty. Halicarnassus, on the other hand, was a bit stronger. After months of sieging, the proper preparations were made. Alexander stormed the city with all the siege equipment he needed. Once Alexander broke through the walls, he realized that all the citizens had already fled. He then set fire to the city. Now that the naval threat of Persia was temporarily quelled, Alexander moved to the mainland of Persia. The first city that Alexander made moves towards was Gordium. Gordium was one of the most respected and important of the western Persian cities. The people of Gordium accepted Alexander, as there was no way they could stand against his overwhelming strength. While staying in Gordium, Alexander was confronted with the legendary Gordian knot, which was a knot that was impossible for any normal man to undo. It was said that whoever could untie the knot would become the king of all of Asia. In an unexpected turn of events, Alexander decided the knot was impossible to untie by conventional means. So he raised his blade and sliced the knot. It may not have been the expected action, but in the end, the knot was undone. The Greek army led by Alexander was now fully rested and regrouped, and they were ready for more conquest. The southwestern part of Persia was the next target. The cities and forts around the area were well armed and well manned, but they were also rich and would be great assets to capture. So Alexander set off from Gordium. During the long journey south, Alexander was met with a surprise. There was a massive Persian army on his flank, led by King Darius III, who was king of all of Persia. The Persian army outnumbered Alexander almost 2-1. King Darius was not cocky though. He assessed the situation carefully, giving a lot of respect to Alexander. Darius decided to go wait and defend on a high ground. He would force Alexander to be the aggressor. King Darius sat on the hill, with a mix of light infantry, Greek mercenaries, cavalry, and the feared Persian immortals. Alexander's army was mostly made up of heavy infantry and cavalry. There were also some light infantry, much like in the previous Battle of Granicus. Alexander decided to launch his attack by charging at the enemy's right side with his companion cavalry. While charging, his line of infantry advanced to meet the Persian line. As the Greek infantry were crossing the river, they were barraged by arrows and met with spears on the other side. This made it hard for them to organize and arrange a good phalanx. The Greek infantry were starting to struggle and be pushed back by the overwhelming force of Persians. Meanwhile, Darius had sent his cavalry to attack the left flank of the Greek army. His cavalry were struggling. They were against outnumbered odds just like the infantry and starting to crumble. Alexander noticed this and regrouped his cavalry for another charge straight into the core of the Persian army. The plan was to relieve pressure off of the struggling Greek troops. That way they could regroup and get some momentum in the battle. This brave and risky plan paid off. Alexander charged his companion cavalry straight into the heart of the Persian infantry, leaving them in shock. The Greek infantry used this moment to push forward and into the Persian line. All the while, Alexander's cavalry on the very left managed to keep stalling out an extreme amount of Persian troops. The battle now favored the Greeks. The Persians began to take heavy losses, and some troops were starting to waver. In an attempt to shake the resolve of the Persian army, Alexander regrouped his companion cavalry one last time and charged straight for King Darius. Darius was rightfully scared of the encroaching force of Greeks and decided to retreat. After Darius retreated, the Persians completely fell apart. With no leadership, they were cut down and slaughtered by the thousands, leaving Alexander with another stunning victory. In the end, the Persians suffered upward of 30,000 casualties, whilst the Greek force only sustained around 5,000. With the massive Persian army destroyed, Alexander was free to continue his conquest into southern Persia. The cities of Marathas, Byblos, and Sidon surrendered at the first sight of Alexander and his army. They were the closest in proximity to the Battle of Issus, and decided that it would be better if they were to surrender than die. One especially stubborn city did not surrender though. That city is Tyre, which is an island city located 700 meters from the nearest spot of land. This made the city extremely resistant to any type of siege. The island city did not scare Alexander, but how would he get an army large enough to invade a city 700 meters across an ocean? He decided to build a land bridge. He used rubble from the recently raided city Old Tyre, which was right next to the island city of Tyre. The bridge was getting built quickly and without issue, until the workers got in range of the city's defenders. At this point, Alexander had siege towers built on the edge of the bridge to protect the workers. The siege towers also had catapults mounted on top to harass the defenders and soften the wall. In retaliation, the defenders of Tyre stacked explosives on a ship and rammed it into the land bridge, which set flame to the siege towers, leaving Alexander's siege on pause. Alexander was not done with the city yet. He called for ships from all the recently captured cities and from Greece to assemble for the siege. Many of the ships that came had catapults and battering rams mounted on the deck. The bridge was able to be built once more due to the protection offered by the new ships. Eventually, one of the ships managed to bring down a large section of wall. This breach in the wall allowed Alexander to take his men and charge straight in. The city's defenders did not stand much of a chance against the battle-hardened aggressors, and were destroyed quickly. Alexander made sure to show no mercy to the defenders. That way, it'd be a show to the rest of the world what happens to those who don't bend to Alexander's rule. After the long siege of Tyre, Alexander continued his conquest southward into Egypt, where he met even more resistance with the fortress of Gaza, which was a fortress with tall stone walls and many defenders. The commander of the fortress, Battis, decided to try and defend the fortress until King Darius could muster a new army, which was a decision that he would soon learn to regret. Alexander's army had finally marched to Gaza and set up a siege to take down the fortress. In the meantime, the siege equipment from Tyre was being transported to Gaza. Once this equipment finally caught up to Alexander's army, they stormed the fortress in waves. The castle walls were tough, and so the first and second assault failed. On the third wave, the aggressors finally managed to break the mighty fortress. The defenders of Gaza stood little chance after their protection was gone. The people of Gaza suffered a fate very similar to those of Tyre, as they were overwhelmed by the undefeatable Greek army. After Gaza was conquered, Alexander moved his forces further into Egypt. He soon reached the major city of Pelusium. In this city, the governor of the whole Egyptian region surrendered the entire country of Egypt to Alexander. The people of Egypt thought highly of Alexander. He was seen as a liberator for the people of Egypt, because the Egyptian people had been conquered by the Persians, who were a lot more authoritarian than Alexander would be. While in Egypt, Alexander was crowned pharaoh during his stay in Memphis, and was even seen as a god. He even formed his very own city, named Alexandria, at the mouth of the Nile River, which is still a major city even today. While Alexander was busy getting everything set up in Egypt, he got word that things were getting heated up back in Greece. Some of the Greek people saw Alexander as a tyrant. One of these people drawing up unrest was King Aegis III of Sparta. Sparta had never liked Macedonia from the start, and so tensions were already high. King Aegis sensed disorder in the Macedonian Empire, and thought the Macedonians would be weak while Alexander was gone so far away. So King Aegis declared war with the financial support of Persia and the military support from mercenaries. The first objective for Sparta would be to take the city named Megalopolis. Before King Aegis could defeat the city, a Macedonian commander quickly marched a large force of soldiers down to Megalopolis to challenge the Spartan force. After a fierce battle, the Spartans were defeated, and King Aegis died in battle. This battle showed the other rebellious parts of Greece what happens if they defy Macedonia. If the mighty Spartans couldn't defeat them in battle, then who could? Back on the Persian front, Alexander decided to start planning his Babylonian campaign. He was now full of confidence. Alexander had not lost a single battle, and now the rebellions back home were crushed. King Darius recognized Alexander's extreme strength and issued a peace offer. Darius would give Alexander a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half of his empire. Alexander rejected the offer. Half of the empire was not good enough. He wanted the whole thing. Alexander's next objective would be to cut the head off the snake by killing King Darius. While traveling east, Alexander was gathering as much information about the whereabouts of Darius as possible. In a very short amount of time, Alexander knew Darius was in Gaugamela. King Darius had been mustering his army for a long time, and had gathered a massive force. He managed to assemble roughly 80,000 troops of all different kinds. Alexander commanded a strong force of 47,000 well-trained soldiers. Darius commanded a large number of light infantry, cavalry, immortals, Greek mercenaries, archers, chariots, and even elephants. Alexander did not have elephants and chariots, but he did have his default composition of light infantry, cavalry, and heavy infantry. If Darius was not able to defeat Alexander here, he might not ever be able to defeat him. King Darius knew that Alexander would be attacking him, so he chose a suitable place to battle. This suitable place was a flat, open field that would allow his chariots to move freely. Before the battle even started, something went sour for the Persians. The 15 war elephants would not be able to fight. Sources say they were withdrawn due to fatigue. The Persians still had the chariots and the numbers advantage to work with. Darius set up his infantry so that they were in a long line and would be in a position to potentially surround the Greek force. He had his cavalry laid out on both flanks and chariots in the front. Alexander did his unfailing default formation: phalanx in the front, hoplites to guard the flanks, then cavalry on each flank and hoplites in the back as reserves. The first move of the battle was made by Alexander. He led his companion cavalry in a charge way off on the enemy's left flank. The purpose was to try and get Darius to move a large part of his army to face towards Alexander. This way, Alexander's infantry could face the main part of the Persian army with favorable odds. Darius did what Alexander expected and sent his cavalry on the flank to meet Alexander and his companion cavalry. Darius then sent his chariots to charge the infantry and destroy the Macedonian morale. Alexander's army was well trained now. They knew what to do in this situation and executed it perfectly. As the chariots charged, the Greek infantry made gaps in their lines to allow the chariots to pass through. As they passed, the Greeks threw javelins, which rendered the chariots useless. Darius wanted to keep his momentum up, so he ordered his entire right wing of cavalry to charge the left side of Alexander's army. The Greeks' left flank was completely outnumbered, but they managed to hold the Persians. The Persian king saw the Greeks struggling and wanted to press his advantage. He sent his front row of infantry to charge the Macedonian phalanx. This attack was not really effective and ended up being a huge mistake. Alexander had been waiting for Darius to expose himself and took advantage of Darius' mistake. He charged straight at the center of the Persian army, where Darius was located. The clash of cavalry shocked many of the Persian soldiers, who were starting to waver and flee. King Darius, who was the target of the charge, did not fight for long before fleeing for his life. This caused all of the soldiers in his proximity to flee as well. The fight was still raging in other parts of the battlefield, so Alexander did not spare much time before regrouping and charging again. This time at the left flank, which was being overrun by Persians. Shortly after the companion cavalry made contact with the left flank, the Persians were in full rout. In the end, casualties were extremely high for Darius, ranging around 40,000, while Alexander proclaimed that he lost only 500 men, with another 5,000 being wounded. Darius fled to Ecbatana with the hope of holding the remnants of the Persian Empire. Alexander moved to take the famous city of Babylon. When he reached the city, the Persian officials accepted Alexander as the new ruler. From Babylon, he moved to Susa and captured one of Persia's biggest treasuries. From Susa, Alexander moved to Persepolis, but was stopped in the mountains at the Persian gates. There was a Persian army defending the gates. This would have caused a serious problem, but Alexander found out about a small mountain pass that goes around the gates. Once the Macedonian army was able to surround the Persians, the battle was going to be significantly easier. The Persians were killed to the last man before Alexander moved on to Persepolis. Once he got there, he found a large portion of the treasure had been moved to Ecbatana. Treasure was not the main reason that Alexander had come to the city. He came to conquer. Once in Persepolis, Alexander's objective was to use his influence to proclaim himself king of all of Asia. He set up a massive banquet for all those who had recognized Alexander as their new king. There was a problem for Alexander though. Almost none of the eastern satraps and nobles showed up. This meant that Alexander would need to do a little more footwork than he originally thought. After a 5-month stay in Persepolis, Alexander made his next move. He would need to finish off Darius in order to secure the loyalty of the Persian people. Alexander had gotten word that Darius was to the north in the wealthy city of Ecbatana, so he marched straight to the city. Darius had informers all around the empire and knew Alexander's plans already. Darius set off from Ecbatana to escape his death. While fleeing to the east, many of Darius' troops deserted. Conditions continued to worsen for the Persians until eventually one of Darius' satraps, Bessus, turned traitor and imprisoned Darius. Bessus tried to strike a deal with Alexander using Darius as leverage, but Alexander denied Bessus and continued his march. Bessus then killed Darius and crowned himself the new king of Persia. Bessus was the satrap of Bactria, and so he returned to his domain to rule the remains of the Persian Empire. Alexander stopped his march for a while so that he could organize his vast empire. He allowed some of the Persian leaders to keep their positions if they swore loyalty. The other leadership slots were filled by Greek-born officers and leaders. Bessus did not expect Alexander to come for the rest of Persia, and so he thought he would be safe to govern the rest of Persia in peace. Many of the Macedonian troops had thought the same. They had been away from home for 5 years now and were just getting tired of endless conquest. They wanted to rest. The troops were not just tired, they noticed that Alexander had been changing, and not in a way that they liked. Alexander had been integrating with many of the Persian customs, as well as keeping many Persian advisors. They also noticed that Alexander had becoming more and more arrogant, which rubbed the Macedonian troops the wrong way. Alexander considered all of this, but decided to continue his march into Central Asia anyway. His main objective was to chase down and finish Bessus. This would require him to trek deep into Central Asia all the way to Bactria. In order to get into Bactria, Alexander would need to go through a mountain pass. It was winter, and Bessus did not think Alexander would march his army through this mountain pass. So Bessus was shocked to find Alexander and his army near the city Bessus was in. Bessus immediately fled Bactria and went on the run, much like Darius had. And like Darius, he was captured by his own men and turned in to try to appease Alexander. Alexander had Bessus crucified and crowned himself the undisputed ruler of Persia. Not everyone in the Bactria area would surrender to Alexander though. One of the larger opponents was the nomadic Scythians. Scythians were extremely proficient in both horsemanship and archery, and they would present a unique challenge for Alexander. One of the biggest battles against this nomadic group of people would be the Battle of Jaxartes. Alexander took a force of 6,000 men to root out a force of 15,000 rebellious warriors. The battle started with Alexander needing to cross a deep river. In order to cross the river, troops would need to be sent by way of ship. The problem for Alexander was that the Scythians were waiting on the other side of the river. If the troops were sent by boat, they would be shot while crossing. In order to solve this problem, Alexander set up siege bows and catapults on his side of the river. This would force the Scythian troops to stay far from the coast, allowing Alexander's troops to pass safely. Now that Alexander had his forces grouped on the other side of the river, the battle could begin. He started by sending a small force of cavalry in. These cavalry were not supposed to win or do critical damage, they were simply used as bait, and the Scythians took the bait. They encircled the troops that had been sent in, firing arrow after arrow, and dealing damage to the bait, quite heavily. Now Alexander decided to make his move. He sent in his archers to create chaos for the horsemen. Then, while they were distracted, Alexander charged and surrounded the rebels. Once surrounded, these mounted archers did not stand any chance. The Scythians that had been waiting to make a move saw this absolute destruction, and decided it would be better to flee and spare themselves. In the end, Alexander had beat a force almost 3 times the size of his own, sustaining only 160 casualties, compared to the Scythians' 1,200 casualties. He also captured 150 prisoners of war, which he released under the condition that the Scythians would never attack his domain again. The Scythians were not the only ones rebelling against Alexander though, and Alexander spent a significant amount of time crushing rebellions, much like he did when he first became king of Macedonia. In order to strengthen relations with the people of this region, Alexander married Roxanne, the daughter of one of the more powerful chieftains. This marriage would significantly reduce the amount of rebellion in the area, and Alexander could finally move on to conquering other regions. The marriage was not the perfect political move though. Many of Alexander's Macedonian soldiers and companions greatly disapproved of the action. The Macedonians saw themselves as superior to the Persian peoples, and the fact that Alexander was integrating into the culture got on their nerves. The next thing he decided to conquer was India. He mustered a strong force of 35,000 well-trained men and started his Indian campaign. His journey into India started with crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains, which led him to the Indus River Valley. Along the way, Alexander won a number of skirmishes against the local forces. He eventually reached the largest city in the area, Masaga. Alexander thought that by capturing this city, he could hold influence over the immediate area. Alexander underestimated the city. He attacked and failed a few times due to extremely competent enemy mercenaries. He decided to take a more calculated approach. Instead of trying to brute force the city, he spent 9 days building an intricate siege tower. The mercenaries did not know how to deal with such a threat. They had never seen the type of siege equipment that the Macedonians knew how to produce. With the use of this siege equipment, Alexander was slowly starting to win out against the defenders. And the siege would have resulted in many casualties for Alexander, if it weren't for a lucky break. One of Alexander's archers had killed the leader of the mercenary group, resulting in an early surrender for the defenders. Alexander ended up allowing the current ruler of Masaga to continue ruling, as long as they were loyal to Alexander. The city of Taxila was the next closest major city. Instead of being trampled by Alexander, they decided to form an alliance with the Macedonians, and many of the local villages and towns joined Alexander along with Taxila. While moving further into the Indus Valley, Alexander met his first large conflict in India. This conflict was the Battle of Haidaspies. This was going to be one of the first battles where Alexander had an even amount of troops. He had 47,000 men, compared to Porus's 30 to 50,000. There was a wild card in the mix though. Not only did Porus have chariots, he also had war elephants. This would be the first time that Alexander and his men would have to face the mighty elephants in battle. The battle started with the Macedonians camping on one side of the river, and King Porus on the other. Under the cover of night, Alexander moved a majority of his army upstream, leaving behind a chunk to make sure they could go upstream undetected. King Porus did not expect Alexander to cross until the monsoon season was over, due to increased water levels. Once far enough upstream, Alexander led his troops across the river. While crossing, Porus' son was sent to check the crossing point upstream, as Porus had grown suspicious. Porus' son found Alexander's army crossing the river and tried to stop them. This attempt went very poorly for Porus, as the charge was stopped easily by the Greek force, and Porus' son died in the charge. From here, Porus' troops returned to the main army to warn about the encroaching army. Porus gathered his men and got into defensive formation. Alexander had his normal troops along with many new troops from the newly conquered regions of his empire. These new troops would include Scythian mounted archers and infantry from the alliance with Texila. The battle started, and Alexander made his first move. He used the Scythian archers to harass the elephants before moving his front line of infantry forward. The leftover Macedonian army from the other side of the river started to cross, as the Indian soldiers were all preoccupied. Alexander then charged the Indian left flank with his companion cavalry. Soon after the cavalry charge, the Greek infantry formed a phalanx and pressed into the Indian line. The elephants would not go down easily though. The elephants would cause chaos in the Greek lines, managing to break the line of spears at times. The elephants could only handle the endless spears for so long, and they started to break and flee. The scared elephants turned and retreated while running away from the spears. They stomped through the Indian infantry, causing massive disarray. Porus' men were now surrounded, as the Greek force from the other side of the river had finally forged the river and made their way across. The battle was now hopeless for King Porus, yet he never gave up. He fought until he was eventually captured. In the end, Alexander had only lost around 1,000 men. Meanwhile, Porus had lost a massive 12,000. After everything was settled, Alexander decided not to kill Porus. He decided to make Porus a satrap instead. This way, he would not have to worry too much about the stability of the region. Alexander was now off to conquer the mainland of India. He set off east towards the Bias River. The Bias River was said to be the edge of the world by ancient Greek philosophers. When he got to the edge of the river, something stopped his conquest once and for all. It wasn't some great enemy army, but a mutiny by his own men. They had been hearing stories of massive enemy armies across the river, and were extremely homesick, and rightfully so. They had been on this conquest for 8 years now. Many of the men had families at home. They refused to go any further. The Macedonian soldiers would not go further, which frustrated Alexander, but he had no choice. He turned back and headed west. He followed the rivers to the coast. On the way he conquered native peoples and put down any form of resistance. After 10 months, he managed to make it to the sea. Once on the coast, a chunk of his army loaded up onto boats and made the voyage to central Persia. Alexander led the rest of his men on land through a harsh desert. He underestimated the desert. This was a disaster for Alexander. While traveling through, many of his men succumbed to heat stroke and dehydration. After making it through the grueling desert, Alexander reached Persepolis. This is where he paid off the debt all of his soldiers as a token of gratitude. While on his way to Susa, he learned of corruption that had been growing while he was gone. Many of these corrupt officials were Greek nobles that Alexander had placed in satrap positions. In order to curb the corruption, Alexander had all the corrupt officials killed. Then, while in the town of Opis, Alexander ordered that all the older soldiers be sent back home to Macedonia. The Macedonian troops took this the wrong way. They had always disapproved of Alexander's willingness to accept Persian culture, and thought that Alexander was sending away the Macedonian troops because he liked the Persians more. Alexander's Macedonian troops decided to mutiny the town of Opis. In the midst of this mutiny, Alexander gave his most legendary speech. He also threatened high-ranking roles for the Macedonians who would not bow to him. A combo of these elements led the Macedonian troops to reconsider their position. Afterwards, the soldiers were more loyal than they had ever been. In an attempt to create unity between the Persian and Greek subjects, he held a mass marriage in Susa, where he married his senior officers to Persian noblewomen. With disaster averted, Alexander marched to Ecbatana to retrieve the bulk of the Persian treasury. During his stay in Ecbatana, Alexander's closest friend, Hephaestion, died. The cause of death, either poison or illness. Alexander declared a decree of public mourning for his entire empire. Alexander then stayed in Babylon for a while to consolidate his empire and plan his new future. While planning an Arabian campaign, Alexander got sick, and after making one of the largest and most powerful nations in the history of the world, he died, leaving his great empire to be scattered amongst his battling generals and satraps.